The British Empire began with the creation of overseas colonies in the 16th century and stretched right up to the latter half of the 20th century. At its peak in the early 1920s, it controlled 23% of the world's surface and 458 million people. Its power and influence were hugely impressive, but what was the human cost of such a sprawling empire? Join us to find out with 10 shocking facts about the British Empire. Number 10. Amritsar Revolution. After the First World War, there was a growing nationalist sentiment in British-ruled India. To prevent protests, the British government banned large public meetings in many of the country's major cities. Unfortunately, this order wasn't widely broadcast. On the 13th of April 1919, thousands of civilians assembled in a public garden in Amritsar, India's holy Sikh city, as part of celebrations for the annual Baisakhi festival. Hundreds of peaceful protesters also gathered there to make a stand against British imperialism. Upon hearing of the congregation, Colonel Reginald Dyer of the British Indian Army ordered his troops to fire indiscriminately on the unarmed crowd. The soldiers fired for 10 straight minutes. The garden was walled on all sides, making it difficult for people to flee the bullets. The British government later released figures saying that 379 people had been killed and 1,200 injured, although other sources claim there were well over 1,000 fatalities. Dyer was initially praised as a hero for preventing a potential Indian mutiny. He was given a government pension while his victims received nothing. However, his actions were later strongly condemned by the British government. Number 9. Transatlantic slave trade. From the 15th century to the end of the 19th century, between 12 and 15 million people were forcefully transported from Africa to the Western Hemisphere as part of the transatlantic slave trade. Of these, approximately 1.2 to 2.4 million Africans died during transportation, which involved them being forced into tight, unsanitary spaces for months on end. Although the British anti-slavery reform movement was one of the most important forces behind the abolition of the brutal trade, the British Empire was well and truly at the core of the industry. Since the first British slaving voyage to Africa in 1562, it's estimated that British ships made the trip from Africa to America over 10,000 times, kidnapping men, women, and children as young as 8. University of Hull history professor David Richardson calculated that this equates to 3.4 million slaves who were carried by British ships. Number 8. Crushing the Iraqi Revolution. As part of the treaties following the conclusion of World War I, Great Britain was awarded authority over Iraq. Known as Mesopotamia at the time, Iraq was still a fairly new country. The Brits quickly got rid of the Ottoman officials who'd been running the country's administration and replaced them with their own puppet leaders. In May 1920, less than a month later, Iraqi discontent with their imperial overlords reached breaking point and a revolution began. The response of the British Empire was brutal. They used the strength of the Royal Air Force to target villages held by rebel tribes with nighttime bombing raids. It's estimated that the Brits dropped almost 90 kilograms of bombs, killing countless civilians. They conducted random searches of people's houses and, if a single weapon was found, they would burn the village in question to the ground. Rebels, loyalists, children, animals, crops, the destruction was pretty much indiscriminate. Over 10,000 Iraqis were killed during the revolution, which concluded with a British victory in October 1920. Number 7. The Aden Emergency. Although the second half of the 20th century saw the gradual dissolution of the British Empire, it was not without its imperial atrocities. In the 1960s, anti-imperialist sentiment broke out in Aden, a small area in the south of the Arabian Peninsula which is now part of Yemen. Since 1839, Aden had been home to a crucial British port, so they were not going to let the area go without a fight. The primary British strategy was brutality. Nationalists from Aden were rounded up and taken to locations that have since been nicknamed torture centres. According to a 1966 Amnesty report, the centre saw inmates being stripped and kept in refrigerated cells, having cigarettes extinguished on their skin, being deprived of sleep for days on end, and being sexually assaulted. By September 1967, the British-controlled government collapsed, and talks began to negotiate Britain's withdrawal from the area. The last British troops left Aden 2 months later. Number 6. New villages. In the 1950s, the British Empire was facing threats from armed communist insurgents, who sought to take over Malaysia, which was then the Federation of Malaya. There was considerable support for the insurgents from the peasant population, which led the Brits to the conclusion that they'd be difficult to defeat in regular combat. Therefore, rather than dealing with the insurgents themselves, the British Army decided to destroy their support system by targeting the peasants instead. They rounded up approximately 500,000 civilians and resettled them in heavily guarded camps, nicknamed New Villages. But these villages were far from homely. Villagers were forced to live with barbed wire fences, armed wardens, extremely poor sanitation, and scant food rations. Contact with the outside world was also strictly forbidden, even among families that had been ripped apart as part of the program in order to prevent influence from the insurgent rebels. Historians generally agree that the New Villages achieved their intended goal of preventing a communist rebellion. However, it didn't stop general nationalist sentiment, and the Federation achieved independence in 1957. Number 5. Irish Famine. The Irish famine of 1845 to 1852 is well known as one of the most devastating events of modern history. It was fundamentally caused by the mass infection of potato crops. However, it was considerably exacerbated by the actions of the British Empire. British civil servant Sir Charles Trevelyan was put in charge of the relief effort, but he arguably did way more harm than good. Trevelyan strongly believed that the famine was God's way of punishing the Irish for being lazy, and that the British government should not interfere with market forces. He described the disaster as an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. As a result, he actually refused to hand out food to starving Irish. Instead, he forced dying individuals into hard labour constructing roads so they could earn money to buy grain. This was a colossal failure, as the price of grain skyrocketed beyond the workers' wages and Trevelyan refused to control it. Approximately 1 million people died and another million emigrated away from Ireland, meaning that the country's population declined by about 25%. Number 4. Partitioning of India. India and Pakistan won independence from the British Empire in August 1947, the result of decades of nationalist struggles. The task of negotiating the British exit and deciding what to do with the Indian subcontinent fell to English lawyer Cyril Radcliffe. Radcliffe made the tough but arguably necessary call to split British India into the separate countries of India and Pakistan based on religious lines. Pakistan became a Muslim country and India became a mainly Hindu country. The decision itself wasn't necessarily met with much contention, but what was problematic was how poorly the partition was executed. Britain rushed through the negotiations very quickly, leaving the general population without suitable warning of what was going to happen. As a result, 14.5 million people ended up displaced on the wrong side of the new border. The brand new Indian and Pakistani governments were not equipped to deal with the migration of such a vast number of people. Tensions between the two religions rose and violence soon broke out. Estimates for how many people were killed during this violence range from 200,000 to 2 million people. Number 3. The Boer concentration camps. The term concentration camp and the atrocities associated with them are usually reserved for the barbaric acts of the Nazis during the Holocaust. Yet, shockingly, the British Empire got there first. During the Second Anglo-Boer War from 1899 to 1902, the British rounded up 100,000 Boer people and detained them in camps. The majority of those imprisoned were women and children. The conditions were unspeakably bad, and the spread of diseases like measles, typhoid and dysentery was rife. Food rations were dire, with the families of Boer men still fighting against the Brits routinely given smaller allowances than other inmates. According to the UK archives, between 34 and 42,000 civilians died of disease in these camps. The use of the camp succeeded in terms of achieving military success, as it's believed they were a major factor behind the Boer surrender. However, they provoked mass public criticism of the British Empire, with early 20th century campaigner Emily Hobhouse denouncing the camps as a Holocaust. Number 2. Famine in India. In 1943, at the peak of the Second World War, a crisis was raging through British-controlled India. Years of inefficient agricultural practices, poor harvests and population pressures all culminated in one of the deadliest famines of all time. The numbers from this horrendous disaster are staggering. Somewhere between 3 and 5 million Indians are estimated to have perished. And the actions of British imperialists actively worsened the problem. When Leopold Amery, the Secretary of State for India, turned to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill for help, Churchill turned him down. The often celebrated wartime leader argued that the Indians had brought the famine on themselves by breeding like rabbits. As well as refusing to send life-saving food packages to severely affected regions, Churchill continued to allow the diversion of wheat from India to British soldiers fighting abroad. Even at the height of the famine between January and July 1943, Britain exported more than 63.5 million kilograms out of India. This would have been enough to keep nearly 400,000 people alive for a full year. Number 1. The Mau Mau Uprising. It would appear as though the British Empire learned nothing from the atrocities of the Second Boer War or the Nazi systematic execution of an estimated 11 million people, and in the 1950s they turned to concentration camps once more. Camps were used in retaliation against the Mau Mau Uprising from 1951 to 1960. The uprising took place in British Kenya, where members of the Kikuyu tribe rebelled against imperialist rule. According to the Kenya Human Rights Commission, an estimated 160,000 people were imprisoned in these so-called British gulags, where they were systematically tortured. This torture included malnourishment, sexual assault, flogging, and prisoners' ears being cut off. And the camps weren't the only extreme method that the British used to squash the Mau Mau uprising. They launched an aggressive and indiscriminate military campaign against the Kikuyu people, executing, torturing and maiming approximately 90,000 Kenyans and pillaging whole communities. In recent years, 40,000 victims of British brutality have sought millions of dollars in compensation from the UK government for the torture, rape, wrongful detention and forced labour they suffered. So far, they have received over $3.5 million in compensation. So that was 10 shocking facts about the British Empire. Which of these did you find the most alarming? Let us know in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to like, subscribe and check out the video playing on screen now.